Hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Welcome to another Fiber Strike 95 stream here today. This is Fiber Strike 95. I hope you guys have had a good week this week. And today we're back here with another Friday game day flight. But today we're actually here in Canada. More specifically, we're right here in Quebec. And today we're here to cover our very first ever NHL game day here in the NHL. And we're not just going to cover any NHL game, but one that's actually been a significant part of the sport itself. And yes, we're talking about the Montreal Canadiens and the Toronto Maple Leafs. This historic matchup here has been around since before the NHL even existed, and this classic rivalry has been faced off over 850 times throughout their history. They've been involved in so much of NHL history, including multiple Stanley Cup finals, playoff appearances, and has shaped not just the sport, but Canada itself, the cultural fabric of the country. So guys, I hope you all have a good week and enjoy your time here. So before we get started, I do want to say hello to everyone in chat. Super Typhon, good to see you. And all the lurkers, hello. So we're right here in Charlie Sierra Kilo 3. So here's our route in server today. We're on Southeast Asia, of course. So that's where we're going at. Negative 11 degrees Celsius, Typhon. Yeesh. It's 12 degrees Fahrenheit from where you're at. So here's our flight plan before we get started. So here's our flight plan for the flight, courtesy of our little NAM map. We're going to start at Masouche Airport. I know it's currently built by Jobbitzer stuff now, but it's in the sim. So we'll start here. We'll fly into downtown Montreal. We'll fly past the Olympic Stadium. We'll fly past it. Then from there, we'll enter into downtown Montreal, and we'll fly over the Bell Center, the Notre Dame Cathedral, and the Bell Center. Bell, home of the Canadiens, of course. Then from there, we'll fly through Park Mount Royal and fly over Mount Royal, check out this historic park. And then from there, we'll head over west to our first stop in Ottawa. We'll land at Ottawa Rockcliffe Airport is where we're going to stop first. Then from Rockcliffe, we'll head over through downtown Ottawa, and then we'll check out the capital of Canada, by the way, is Ottawa. Then from there, we'll visit the Canadian Tire Center, home of the Ottawa Senators, one of the two big NHL franchises in Ontario. Then we'll head all the way down to our second stop at Norwood Airport, Charlie Papa Yankee 4, and then from there we'll head over to the biggest city in Canada, Toronto. And we're going to be flying into downtown Toronto. We'll go into the Scotiabank Arena and the Rogers Center, in Tower. We're checking all those, and then we'll make our landing here at Billy Bishop Airport. At Billy Bishop Toronto City Airport for our last stop. So yeah, that's going to be our flight plan for this afternoon stream. Should be some really cool flying here this morning. Of course, being in Canada, obviously. So we're going to take the Beechcraft Bonanza today. I thought this would be a pretty cool plane. But also, interesting fact about the Beechcraft Bonanza is actually, this plane is not going to be in production anymore. That's right. The Bonanza the production of this will end. It's announced that last month that Textron has actually ceased production of the Beechcraft Bonanza. And it's because this plane's going to be replaced by the Beechcraft Denali. So yes, this plane is going to end production once the final backlog. So, yeah, from 1947 until 2026, I believe. Depending on how long it's going to be. Crazy that this is going to be this could be the last version of the Bonanza we're going to be seeing. Crazy, I know. So, pretty crazy stuff. CYTZ, yep, that's Forder's airport. That's right, that's Forder. We're going to go ahead and get this plane started and get. So, another news as well. By the way, before we get started, there is one more really big piece of news that I bet a lot of content creators are probably looking forward to this. You guys all probably know Parallel 42. They for their product Flow. Well, it's now officially going to be released on PC for MSFS 2024. That's right. Flow is back. I'm not going to get Flow right now. I'm gonna get it after I upgrade my after I build my game PC and stuff. I'm gonna get Flow for it back. But yes, Flow is officially back, which is gonna be really nice to have. I myself will love Flow, so it'd be great to have it back for all you guys. You guys be pretty excited for that. So we're gonna go and make our way down to the taxi. So our altitude for this trip, by the way, we don't have to fly really high. We'll start at 1,500 feet, of course. And we're going to be and the heading is going to be 183 degrees heading. So, but I'm looking very much forward to this flight with all you guys. This is going to be a lot of fun to explore a new country, of course, is in Canada. So the reason I picked this game today is ultimately because this is going to be the only time of the season that we're going to have the Canadiens Maple Leafs in the weekend at that point. Um, which is why we ultimately picked it for this weekend, of course. So it was the only one we picked for that weekend. That's what we picked here today. Let's go ahead and make our way up 1,500 feet. So yes, guys, I'm actually getting a new gaming PC finally. My brother picked out all the parts for it, but I'm finally getting a new PC after so many years with this laptop. Now I'm still gonna keep it. I'm just not gonna be using it for. we go, guys. We're going to officially climb to 1,500 feet. So we're going to enter into Montreal. If you guys don't know about Montreal, of course, Montreal is the largest city in Quebec. Though it's not the capital of Quebec, the provincial capital is actually further northeast in Quebec City, which I've been to. I've actually also seen a bit of Montreal, and I think we're going to go back to Montreal fully next year. I want to visit Montreal, but this city's actually the second largest in all of Canada and the 8th largest city in North America. And it's a very old city, 1642 when it was founded. It's historically been very important as a center of art, culture, literature, film, music, commerce, transportation, and more across Canada. In fact, it was also UNESCO City Design in 2006, and it's one of the world's most livable cities. It's really one of my favorite looking cities in Canada. I would love to visit. Even once hosted the Olympics. In fact, it's the only Canadian city to ever host the Summer Olympics back in 1976. So this is a very important city, and there are lots of really great places. It's the cultural capital of Canada for a reason, and there's so many really cool things in Montreal. Basilicas, historic buildings. There's no shortage of all sorts of things you can find in. Really great stuff. So we'll be flying over. First would be the Olympic Stadium, which was actually the host. This was the main stadium site for the 1976 Olympics. It was actually held in Olympic Stadium. Fun fact as well, this was also the longtime home of the baseball team, the Montreal Expos. This was their main home for them until they moved to Washington, D.C. back in 2005. And I still think it was a waste of money, though. That Olympic Stadium was a big waste of the money, though. So we will be flying over it soon. Next to it is the Stadium Saputo, which is currently the home of CF Montreal, which is the MLS club here in Montreal, one of the 3 MLS clubs in Canada. The other ones being Toronto and Vancouver. Here is Olympic Stadium and all the rest. First, yeah, that is Olympic Stadium. Pretty cool stuff. Gonna be going through. We'll be heading our way down to to our right. This island is St. Helens Island. This is where they both host the Montreal Grand Prix is held here in the island, and it's also where you can find the theme park La Ronde, which is a little theme park in this area. This is La Ronde, of course. So we're about to enter into downtown Montreal. So there is Port Royal, absolutely beautiful area here in this part of Montreal. Great city. Then we'll turn a little bit to the right. If you look to our right, we're going to go a little closer to this. Bless you. So if you look to our right, you can actually see this stadium down here. This is the Bell Center. This is the home of the Montreal Canadiens. 22,000 people play here. It's actually the highest capacity arena in the NHL. So, if you're a big fan of Montreal Canadiens, this is definitely a place to make a pilgrimage to if you're an ice hockey fan. This is definitely one of the places you really want to visit because you know about Montreal, they live and breathe hockey in Montreal. And as buildings, of course. So that is a bit of downtown Montreal for you. Absolute gorgeous city. Really cool views, of course. So, yeah, we're going a little slow here because I wanted to actually get a view of downtown Montreal. So this is Mount Royal. This is the big park in the city. It's the famous city park. But the most famous thing about Mount Royal Park, the famous buildings here, the most well-known building landmark. Yeah, we're about to finally make our way in. Now we're finally heading to our first stops. Let's go ahead and talk about our topic for today for our game day flight. And this is the Canadiens versus Maple Leafs rivalry. The Canadiens and Maple Leafs, of course. This legendary ice hockey rivalry dates all the way back to 1970. They're actually two of the oldest teams in the league. Been established in 1909 and 1917, respectively. And it's between the two biggest NHL clubs in Canada. In fact, they first met back on December 16th, 1917 was when they first met, of course. You guys, they played over 850 times since then. Is a lot. But the Canadiens and Maple Leafs have been playing each other for decades. And even though they have competed against each other since the beginning of the league, the rivalry really picked up once the Montreal Maroons folded. And as a result, the Canadiens and Maple Leafs were the only Canadian-based teams in the NHL until 1970. As a result, this rivalry became extremely big. And both teams even saw success during the original Six era, where the Canadiens and Maple Leafs won the Stanley Cup in 19 of the 25 seasons. And this rivalry became even more exacerbated by the societal issues in mid-20th century Canada. Yes, a lot of people outside Canada may not know about this, but there is a cultural divide in Canadian society. You have the more English-speaking people from Ontario, which was a lot more English because the English was the one who settled this area back in the 17th 18th centuries. With the English-speaking population of Canada represented by the Maple Leafs, whereas the French-speaking side of Canada in Quebec represented by the Canadiens. And obviously, with those two being a big deal in that culture divide between English-speaking Ontario and French-speaking Quebec, there's obviously a cultural divide. And as a result, the rivalry association with these issues has left a pretty large imprint on modern Canadian culture. Most notably, anyone who's been around Canada has read the short story The Hockey Sweater, which was written by Roque Carrier, by Quebecois author Roque Carrier. Probably know what I'm talking about. But unfortunately, and they've met in the playoffs 16 times in 5 Stanley Cup Finals. However, they haven't been nearly as big of a deal as it was back then because obviously the franchise's fortunes have been changed quite a bit since the 50s and 60s. This is still a very important one for the NHL, of course. So the history of this, so a bit of background, like I said, the rivalry predates the foundation of either club. As remember, these have been major economic rivals since the mid-19th century and culturally since the mid-20th century. Toronto emerged as an economic rival to Montreal during the 1850s. And although Montreal remained the province of Canada's largest city, Toronto's population also grew significantly. And also during that time, there were also in cultural differences. Again, Montreal was always been viewed as the cosmopolitan center for culture, which contrasted with Toronto's pre-World War era reputation as a small city and a bastion for Victorian morality. And obviously, once Canada became the Confederation that built modern-day Canada, they became even more of a rival than already was. And it's even more so for a lot of stuff here as well. And of course, this rivalry stuff doesn't even just stick to the NHL. While it's most famously stuck into the NHL, there have also been other rivalries too in Montreal and Toronto sports, most notably the MLS, and at one point, Major League Baseball had a rivalry. But of course, the two are still rivals even today. It's not actually new or any of it. The history of the Maple Leafs during the NHL's first 25 seasons, Montreal and Toronto only played one playoff series. That was during the 19th NHL Championship in the one in 1925. Toronto won the first game of the series 7-3, and the Canadiens won the second game 4-3. With the Canadiens' Harry Meeke scoring the hat trick during the game. Toronto, however, advanced to win the Stanley Cup final in 1980, winning one of their first Stanley Cup finals. Of course, as at the time, it was a 2-game series, and it was determined by the total goals scored. Yes, most playoff games nowadays are determined in a series. Whoever gets the most wins moves on. But in the case of this, it's about the number of total goals scored. And then during the 1925 series in the NHL Championship, the Canadiens outscored the St. Patrick's, which was the Maple Leafs at the time, were called the St. Patrick's, scoring 5-2. And both series consist of both games, where the winner was scored by the determining number of goals, and champions from both series advanced to the Stanley Cup final. And this was actually the last one until 1926. However, the rivalry truly grew, once the Montreal Maroons folded in 1938. And the Maroons, basically, for those who don't know, they were the second team in Montreal. Yes, Montreal used to have 2 NHL teams. Two major ice hockey teams. And it was actually founded more by the English community in Montreal. So, pretty interesting stuff. However, once they folded, the Canadiens and Maple Leafs remained the only main Canadian teams from 1938 to 1970, which enabled both teams to recruit a number of fans across Canada as the only 2 teams in the country. But the true golden age of this rivalry occurred between 1904 to 1967, because during the 40s and 60s, the 2 teams reigned exclusively as Stanley Cup champions during the decade. Except in 1961, which the Blackhawks won the Stanley Cup, which was the Blackhawks' last Stanley Cup, by the way, until their curse ended back in 2010. Back in 2009-2010. Yes, a lot of people don't know that. And the rivalry between the 2 teams really picked up in 1946 when assistant manager Frank J. Selke left the Maple Leafs to become the general manager of the Montreal Canadiens, having left the Maple Leafs due to tensions with their organization between him and their manager director at the time, Conn Smythe, who For those who don't know, aren't really familiar with him, Conn Smythe was the big businessman of the Toronto Maple Leafs from 1927 to 1961, and he's actually the namesake of the Conn Smythe Trophy, and that is to be the most valuable player in the playoffs, by the way. And of course, they faced off many times throughout all. I mean, they met in multiple Stanley Cups during this golden period. 1947, they met in two semifinals, 1944, 1945. They met in five different Stanley Cups during this period, and met a ton of times in the playoffs. Of those those 5 Stanley Cups between the Maple Leafs Canadiens during the 1940 to 1967, the Maple Leafs won 3 of them, with the Canadiens winning 2 of them. But of course, the zenith of this rivalry was in 1967 during the centennial year of the Canadian Confederation. And the year was Montreal hosting the Expo 67. Of course, an exhibit space has actually been prepared for the Stanley Cup at that time at the Expo's Quebec Pavilion, as the heavily favored Canadiens were supposed to beat the Maple Leafs quite handily. However, that wasn't actually the case in 1967, as the Toronto Maple Leafs pulled off a big upset, which captured the cup in 1967, with the team opting to present it at the Expo's Ontario Pavilion instead. And yeah, Montreal Canadian fans did not like any of that at all. Those two definitely are very bitter rivals. Oh yeah, and here's the crazy thing too about that 1967 Stanley Cup final. It's still been it is still the last time the Maple Leafs have ever won the Stanley Cup. They're still been looking for another Stanley Cup. In fact, it's the longest active championship drought in the NHL. Which is pretty crazy to think about, that the Maple Leafs still haven't won a Stanley Cup. It's been 57 seasons. Yeah, poor Maple Leafs fans. They've still been waiting. The only other franchise that has a nearly as long of a drought is the Buffalo Sabres and Canucks with 54 seasons, but those clubs have not won a Stanley Cup. And the longest of a previous Stanley Cup champion was the Philadelphia Flyers, still waiting for 49 seasons to win a Stanley Cup. Pretty crazy stuff. However, the last 2 postseason series between the 20th century for both the Canadiens and the Maple Leafs happened during the 1978 and 1979 Stanley Cup playoffs, with the Canadiens sweeping the Maple Leafs both times en route to winning their Stanley Cups during the late 70s dynasties for the Canadiens. In fact, during that late 70s dynasty, the Canadiens won 4 straight Stanley Cups. 1976 to 1979, they won 4 of them. However, after that part, from 1981 to 1998, Toronto and Montreal were, for some reason, put in opposite conferences. What was the NHL thinking by putting these 2 historic rivals on different conferences? Just why? Apparently they said they realigned the team for better geographic locations. Yeah, they put Toronto in the Western Conference, put it in the Clarence Campbell Conference, which was the equivalent of the Western Conference in the NHL. So as a result, because of it, it cooled this rivalry significantly. And also making this rivalry cooler was definitely the fact that the Maple Leafs and Canadiens had very opposite fates during this time period. The Canadiens have won 10 Stanley Cups since 1967. The Maple Leafs have still yet to reach the Stanley Cup final. Yes, they've been still looking for a Stanley Cup final appearance. I mean, the closest Toronto has been to the Stanley Cup in recent memory, of course. And they have never been to the Stanley Cup. The closest the Maple Leafs have gotten to the Stanley Cup since 1967 would have to go all the way back to the 1985 season where they lost to the Blues. And they've been through they've nearly lost a couple of conference finals in the past, but that's the closest they've been to making the Stanley Cup final. On May 29th, 1992, Pat Burns resigned as the Canadiens head coach and was hired by the Maple Leafs that same day, adding more fuel to the fire for the rivalry. And Burns, he actually led the Canadiens to the 1989 Stanley Cup, but he lost to the Calgary Flames, which we will cover in a future Game Day flight too with the Calgary Flames Oilers. And then in 1998, the Maple Leafs finally moved to the Eastern Conference, thankfully, and rekindled the rivalry, though the teams didn't meet until 2021 in the postseason. In the first decade of the 2000s, the two teams have eliminated each other for the Stanley Cup playoffs on multiple occasions. The Canadiens eliminated the Maple Leafs in 2005-2006. Then the Maple Leafs knocked them out knocked the Canadiens out of the playoffs for next season. Of course, they would finally meet back in the playoffs. Then in 2013, Canadiens, Maple Leafs, Senators were placed in the same division, of course. Then in 2017, the Maple Leafs beat the Canadiens 4-3 in overtime, ending a record-breaking 14-game losing streak against their rivals dating back to 3 years ago in 2014. But the big one was the 2021 season, where they played each other 10 times that year due to the COVID pandemic, the most being since 1967, which the Maple Leafs dominated that season series 7-2-1. And during that same season, the Canadiens and Maple Leafs finally met in the playoffs for the first time since 1979. In the end, the Canadiens actually made a comeback after the Leafs left the series 3-1, but Montreal Canadiens made the comeback and won the series 4-3, 7 games, including a 3-1 victory game 7 to push their run to the Stanley Cup final, their first since their last Stanley Cup championship season in 1993. So that'll be concluding about the history of the Montreal Canadiens and Toronto Maple Leafs rivalry. And that covers our history lesson of this historic rivalry. So that basically covers it, guys, for that section of the rivalry. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I put some evidence to this and put some really cool stuff. So this is so happy Friday, everyone. I hope you all have a good week. My week's going pretty good. We got some stuff going on, of course. So for streaming this week, Murphy's going to be back later today. He'll be doing a really play in Canada, but this time in the island of Newfoundland. He'll be doing it in the Cessna 414 Chancellor into Newfoundland for On Air. On Saturday, Allison Johnson will be back for another historical recreation from Tallahassee all the way to Havana. Should be a really cool flight, flying through Florida into Cuba. Should be really cool. That will be what she's going to be doing. And of course, Sunday, our Sunday stream will be covering our 10th National Park Hawaii volcanoes. So, should be a very enjoyable experience for sure. So, that is basically what's going to go happen this weekend, of course. For a bit of sports activity this week, I did watch the Pericos Espanol lost the Copa del Rey. That made me sad, but oh well. This weekend, of course, there have been other big games this weekend. Benfica and Sporting are happening today. Today was supposed to be the Lisbon Derby today, with Benfica and Sporting. This was a tough choice, but I mean, soccer, they usually play each other twice in a season. So, whereas this was the only time of the year the Montreal Canadiens and Maple Leafs would be playing this week. So, plus I want to have more variety in sports. I didn't want to cover just soccer or American football. I wanted other sports to be covered, and I think that would be a better choice. So in terms of the standings this year for the NHL, of course, they're both in the Atlantic Division. Montreal is currently third in the Atlantic Division. They do pretty all right. They're only just 3 points behind the division Tampa Bay Lightning with a record of 14-9-3. The Maple Leafs, however, are doing a little bit worse. They're just 2 points away. Third to last with the record of 13-11-3. Though Toronto's on a 3-game win streak, so they're not doing too bad. East has been very competitive this year, so the East has been a very competitive division, so it's not surprising everyone's close. So if you want to talk about the best team in the NHL this season, it's been far away the Colorado Avalanche and the Dallas Stars have been clearly the two best teams in the NHL. So it's not really surprising to the top of it. So that's what's going on this week for the NHL court. For my teams, of course, Everton will be playing tomorrow, the Toppies. They'll be taking on Nottingham Forest. I mean, a win here at home would be huge for Everton to continue on a really solid string of games. They basically went undefeated for their last 5 games, so a win here would be really big for the Toppies. Continue on another good run. So I'm looking forward to that. And of course, Espanyol will be playing Sunday against Rayo Vallecano, south part of Madrid. It's a home game, and Espanyol have been doing quite decent, have been pretty good in the league phase this year. And I mean, their only losses this year for Espanyol were against they did lose the Copa Rey, which was probably disappointing, but their only major losses this year were to Villarreal, a Champions League team. That is a Europa League team. Alaves is always tough in the road, and of course, Real Madrid is Real Madrid. Effective. We're going to get back into the plane's cockpit for a bit. So the last thing we'll talk about here in this part of the slide, of course, we'll be talking about the cultural impact of this rivalry. And of course, this is a very and especially one of the most culturally important rivalries in the NHL, and it makes complete sense. For the first 2/3 of the 20th century, professional ice hockey was viewed as one of the few battlefields when French Canadians could excel against their English-speaking counterparts. And the reason being is that, of course, historically, the French Canadians were kind of overlooked because of it being once a French colony, where the rest of Canada is English. So honestly, that sort of alienation. So this was one of the few battlefield French Canadians could excel against the English speaking. And Montreal Canadiens had developed rivalries with several clubs. Prior to that, the Montreal had rivalries with other Canadian ice hockey teams like the Wanderers and the Montreal Maroons. The Franco fans supported the Canadiens, and Anglophones had the latter two teams before their demise. Then, of course, during the original Six era, the rivalry between the two found itself linked to these issues through its dualities. In addition to the city and province the teams were based in, the Canadiens found themselves associated with French Canada and lesser extent Roman Catholicism, while Maple Leafs fans found themselves with the English-speaking part of it, with Protestantism and United Empire loyalists. And as a result, this rivalry has been called a microcosm of Canadian society. However, what changed was the Quiet Revolution in the 1960s produced a more equitable society in Quebec and improved situation for Francophones. And as a result, the rivalry then became less associated with these divisions. Of course, the fan bases of both teams did begin to erode somehow following the original six era, as 5 other Canadian teams joined the league. And those 5 other Canadian teams that have joined the league since then are located in the cities of Winnipeg. Quebec City also occurred as well during that time. Quebec City, there are teams in Quebec City, Winnipeg, Calgary, Edmonton, and Vancouver. Unfortunately, of those one teams since the 1970s, um, Quebec City was the only one that couldn't keep their team, as they actually moved their team over to Colorado to become the Avalanche. The original Winnipeg Jets moved out in 1996 to Arizona to become the Phoenix Coyotes. However, then ice hockey came back to Winnipeg when the Thrashers moved from Atlanta. And of course, the Calgary Flames came to existence when the original Atlanta Flames moved from Atlanta over to Calgary. Yes, apparently Atlanta's cursed with NHL talent, as you can probably tell. That being said, this rivalry still has a lot of pop culture stuff. The rivalry is essential to the children's book, The Hockey Sweater, in which the protagonist, a Canadiens fan, which was based off the author as a kid, was forced to wear a maple sweater, and was eventually adapted into an animated short by the National Film Board of Canada, The Sweater. It's also featured in quite a few murals of the Toronto's College subway station, worked by Charles Patcher. So, yes, this rivalry plays a big role in the Canadian culture and traditions of the country. That concludes a bit about the rivalry itself and talk about its history. Talk more about the other teams once we make our second and third legs. We'll talk more about the other teams, of course. So, so I want to ask you guys an important question. I want to ask you guys. Um, and I wanted to talk about a bit about ice hockey itself. My experience with ice hockey, of course, I did actually attend a game. I actually did attend an NHL game a couple of years ago when I saw the Nashville Predators play um, as well at the Bridgestone Arena. It was really loud, of course. It was very passionate. The Nashville fans are very passionate supporters for sure. A lot of fun though. I would love to go back at some point if I ever do get a chance to go back to Nashville, watch the Predators again. So we're going to continue on moving forward to Rockcliffe Airport. We're not very far from Ottawa. So let me give you a bit background about Ottawa itself. Ottawa is Canada's capital city. It borders the city of Gatineau, which forms the Ottawa-Gatineau metropolitan area. Population is 1 million people, 1.01 million people. Its metro is 1.48 million, which makes it the fourth largest city and metro area in all of Canada. And of course, Ottawa is the political center of the country and the headquarters for the federal government, as it houses many foreign embassies, key buildings, organizations, and institutions of the Canadian government, which include the Parliament, Supreme Court, Resident of the Canada's Viceroy, and the Office of Prime Minister. It was founded back in 1826 as Bytown, and incorporated Ottawa in 1855. Ottawa definitely really interesting. Again, another really cool place to visit. In fact, one interesting thing about Ottawa, of course, is it's home to many of the national museums here in Canada, most as well as monuments and historic sites, and it's among Canada's most visited cities. So some important landmarks and cultural places include, there is a World Heritage Site in the city, the Rideau Canal, which was built, which is actually a UNESCO World Heritage Site, and there are 25 natural historic sites in Ottawa. Of course, you can visit all its museums. Of course, there's tons of museums here in the city. The National Canadian Museum of Nature is built here for natural history and natural science. Of course, there's so many really cool places. They also other really cool museums and stuff. Other really cool places. There's a Canadian Aviation Space Museum, which is the big museum for Canadian aviation, which was at the Ottawa Rockcliffe Airport. They got quite a lot of planes here. It's basically the Canadian version of the Wright Pat Air Base Museum, Ohio. They also have a big Canada Museum, the National Gallery of Canada. It's also around this area, of course. They have a Bytown Museum here as well, which is right in the locks of the Rideau Canal. And they also got a lot of really cool stuff here, and all sorts of historic sites here all across Ottawa. Really neat city. I think very underrated place for sure. People think Ottawa is just all about like government stuff, like DC, but there's tons to do. There's plenty to do in Ottawa. We're gonna land here in Rockcliffe, where you can find the museum. We're going to go ahead and turn off our autopilot. And we're going to arrive at Rockcliffe Airport. Not very far away. So, there's so many really cool Canadian cities I would love to visit. If I had to pick one Canadian city I would love to visit, it would probably be, outside of Montreal, I would love to visit Calgary. Calgary is supposed to be a really cool city. Calgary should be really cool. Here it is. There's Rockcliffe Airport. Welcome to Ottawa, everyone. Get out of the way here, forklift. Out of the way. We'll stop here for just a little bit before we arrive in downtown Ottawa, of course. We'll stop here if you guys want to join on in. We're on the Southeast Asian server. Our exclamation point route will give us the route. So we're going to go ahead and get ready for the next leg of the flight. We'll be getting ready for leg 2. We'll be heading through, this will be our longest leg of the flight. So we'll be getting ready to start very shortly, of course. We'll be flying around 2,000 feet for this leg, of course. So let's go ahead and we'll cover, once we get up in the air and fly over Ottawa, we'll talk about the Montreal Canadiens for a bit. Talk about this historic franchise. Go ahead and we're up and down. We're now going to fly into downtown Ottawa. So, but the major sports team that is in Ottawa is the most popular team in the city is the Ottawa Senators. Having been established back in 1992. They they've been added as an expansion team to the NHL. But before that, Ottawa was actually home to the original Senators, which was one of the founders of the NHL themselves, and were once 11-time Stanley Cup champions. However, due to financial losses, their franchise eventually moved over to St. Louis, become the St. Louis Eagles for only one season. So it took them about over 54 years to finally bring the NHL back to Ottawa, where it belonged. In Ottawa, it has had some postseason success in mainly the early 2000s, including a Stanley Cup appearance in 2007. Unfortunately for them, they ended up losing to the Anaheim Ducks. But they're definitely a pretty well-known team in the NHL. And their big rival, of course, haven't been the Maple Leafs, of course, Battle of Ontario. There's guys downtown Ottawa. Hey, Samuel Drini, good to see ya. Thank you. So here is downtown Ottawa. So we're going to take a picture, of course. Thank you for the fall, Samuel. So we're here in Canada today. We're in Ottawa. We're doing a Gameday flight covering one of the NHL's most important rivalries, the Canadiens and Maple Leafs, of course. Have been huge rivals in the ice hockey since 1917. We actually made our first stop here in Rockcliffe Airport after we flew from around Montreal, of course. We're now heading to our second stop at Norwood Airport, so that would be stop number 2. That's what we're doing here today. Yeah, it probably might be a bot, but I don't really know, so I'm letting you here. So we're gonna go this direction. We're gonna fly over the Canadian Tire Center, which has been the home of the Ottawa Senators since their inception in 1992. Used to be called Corel Center, originally called the Palladium, then became the Corel Center and the Scotia Bank Place. In addition, while the Senators are their most well-known sporting team, their major team that's also here in the city, of course, is the Ottawa Red Blacks of the Canadian Football League, and they've actually been the more successful of the two major Canadian teams. They actually won a Grey Cup in 2016. Oh yeah, and I forgot about when I talked about the rivalry between Toronto and Montreal. I also forgot to cover a bit. I also realized that there was also a big rivalry in Canadian football. Toronto Argonauts and the Montreal Alouettes are the big two rivals in Canadian football. A lot of people may not even know about that, of course. So yeah, I forgot about that. The most successful team to actually win the Grey Cup in Canadian football is the Argonauts, with 19 of them. And they're the oldest professional sports team in North America that still uses its original name. Montreal won 8 of them, of course. And one last fun fact about Canadian football, for some of those that may not know. At one point, Canadian football tried to expand its way into the United States one time during the 90s. Yes, they expanded the CFL into the United States, which was a big fail. Canadian football was never going to compete with the NFL. I appreciate them trying to do something different, but it's never really going to work out. And they made further evidence in the United States, and they actually joined a couple teams from the United States. They added teams in Sacramento. They added a team from Vegas, unbelievably, the Posse. San Antonio, Shreveport, yes, Shreveport in Louisiana, the Birmingham, Alabama, Memphis, Tennessee, and most famously and most successfully, Baltimore. So here it is, guys. This is Canadian Tire Center, home of the Senators, of course. And fun fact about that too, the Baltimore Stallions actually only lasted for 2 seasons. And they're the only champion of the CFL from the United States and become the only CFL franchise to ever win the Grey Cup. So pretty interesting stuff. We're gonna go ahead and start talking about I'm gonna climb up to 2,000 feet, of course. So we're gonna go ahead and talk about the Montreal Canadiens for a bit. The big NHL club here, the NHL franchise here in Montreal. The Canadiens, based in Montreal, found back in 1909. They're the oldest they're the oldest continuously professional ice hockey team worldwide, and the only NHL club to predate the founding of the league. The NHL, by the way, was founded back in 1917. So yes, this team predates them by 8 whole years, and they're one of the earliest North American sports franchises. The Canadiens' history predates that of every other Canadian franchise outside of the CFL's Toronto Argonauts and every American franchise outside of baseball and the NFL's Arizona Cardinals. So yes, this is an old team with a ridiculously rich history. You ask me. Of course, they were one of the original 6 of the NHL from 1942 to 1967, and they have been the NHL's most successful franchise by a wide margin, winning a record 24 Stanley Cups since 23 of them since founding the NHL, and one in 1915, and 22 of them since 1927. The NHL teams were the only ones for this cup. This puts them the most of any team in North America, and they were the most successful team in North America until the New York Yankees won their 25th World Series title in 1999. So yes, this is an insanely successful NHL franchise. In fact, in terms of Stanley Cups, the Canadiens have won 24 of them. Now, the team with the next most Stanley Cups in terms of outside the Canadiens, the next most successful team to win the Stanley Cup in terms of Stanley Cup championships are its rival Toronto Maple Leafs with 13. The Maple Leafs have won 23. In fact, the Canadiens and Maple Leafs have won a combined 37 Stanley Cups. 37 of them. 37 of them. Then after those two, it is the Red Wings at 11, the Bruins at 6, and the fifth most, and also tied with that is the Chicago Blackhawks with 6. So those are the 5 most successful teams to win the Stanley Cup. Outside of those two, the other most successful Canadian team in the Stanley Cup are the Edmonton Oilers with 5 of them, and all but one of those was won during the Wayne Gretzky era. including 4 and 5 years between 1984 to 1988. Pretty crazy stuff. But the Canadiens, super successful team, of course, obviously have had a rich history. They also do their broadcast both in English and French, of course. Quebecois team should be that surprising. Earlier, they're head coached by former Tampa Bay Lightning great Martin St. Louis. He's their head coach. And of course, the team colors are red, white, and blue. Pretty clear about the colors as well. Of course, the unique thing about the Montreal Canadiens, their identity. This is I could talk all day about their history, of course, but I want to cover their team identity. And yes, the organization operates in both English and French. So yes, they're bilingual. Makes sense because they are in Quebecois. For many years, public address announcements and press releases have actually been given in both languages. The team website and social media are both languages as well. Now, at home, the first stanza of "O Canada" is actually sung in French. The rest of Canada's anthem is sung in English. But of course, if you gotta pick one really cool thing about the Canadiens, of course, is their logo, and it's one of the most recognizable in all of ice hockey. The classic CH of the Canadiens, first used in the 1917-18 season, when the club changed its name to Club de Hockey Canadien from Club Athletic Canadien, and it's gone through quite a few changes until its final form in 1902 and 1953. The middle stands for hockey, not habitants, which is a popular misconception, but H meant hockey. In fact, the Hab is actually their nickname. The Habs is actually their official nickname. The first brand to refer to them was actually the American Tex Rickard. And apparently he said the H standard for the Habitants, which is still the nickname to their day, crazy enough. Of course, their team colors are blue, white, and red. The home sweater is predominantly red in color and features 4 blue and white stripes, one across each arm, one across the chest, and the other across the waistline. The main road sweater is white, with red and blue stripe across the waist, red at the arm sleeves, and red shoulder yokes. And the basic design has been used since 1914, the current uniform being dating back to 1925. Due to its team's lengthy history in Quebec and significance in Quebec, the sweater has been referred to as La Sainte Flannel, Holy Flannel Sweater. And as of 2015, the Canadiens' home red sweater is the only uniform in the NHL to feature the French version of the NHL Shield logo in the color. Of course, they did rarely use a few alternates, of course, but it's very rare to see the word alternate because the red and white are just such an iconic part of French Canadian culture. Of course, they also have a mascot. His name is Youppi. They actually adopted him as their official mascot. And what happened was that Youppi was actually the mascot, was the longtime mascot of the Montreal Expos. But when the franchise moved to Washington, D.C., Youppi changed and ended up being the mascot of the Canadiens. And he became the first mascot of professional sports to switch leagues. He's a pretty special mascot, of course. Youppi is the iconic mascot, and he's even part of the Mascot Hall of Fame. Very cool mascot, a lot of rich history, of course, with him. It's definitely a pretty cool little mascot. Now, one interesting thing about Montreal, of course, the Canadiens. Of course, we all know their blue Maple Leafs rivalry with the Maple Leafs is their most iconic rivalry. And it makes sense considering that this was historically been one of the most important rivalries of the sport. However, there is one other really big rivalry when we have to talk about, and one with a ton of hatred. Whereas the Canadiens Maple Leafs rivalry was more of culturally and historically important, The rivalry with the Bruins, there is far more hatred in that rivalry in comparison, and I might want to in the future, in case if we ever do an NHL series, if they ever meet in the playoffs, I'm covering this rivalry because the Bruins and Canadiens bleeping hate each other. They probably hate each other even more so than the Maple Leafs game. And more importantly, this is actually the most played of the two rivalries that Montreal has. And it dates back to 1924, and they played 942 games in that rivalry. And it's one of the most bitter rivalries in sports, right up there with Yankees Red Sox. These two absolutely hate each other, and especially thanks to all the violence, of course. One particular moment that happened in that rivalry was in 1955 when Bruins defenseman Hal LaCoy high-sticked Maurice Richard in the head, and Richard took 5 stitches to cut a head in his back. And that rivalry ended up creating a fight, and eventually those flares eventually caused a game, and eventually Richard was given a penalty and a $100 fine. And eventually all this led to an official riot that happened, the Richard riots, heard rioting in Montreal. And they caused over $500,000 damage to the neighborhood itself. So yeah, pretty crazy stuff. But this rivalry has had so many playoff meanings too. I mean, they met so many times in the playoffs. These two have met a lot. Now, the other rivalry the Canadiens had was briefly they had a rivalry with the Quebec Nordiques from 1975 to 1995. And this rivalry was more of a regional rivalry in the province, of course. And there was a particularly big meeting in the playoffs in 1984 called the Good Friday Massacre that led to multiple brawls occurring between these two. However, the end of this rivalry, of course, happened when the Nordiques left for Colorado. However, still to this day, the rivalry still never died out. But this was still a pretty heated rivalry during that time period. Pretty important stuff when we're covering. In terms of notable Canadian players, of course, there are so many Montreal players. I mean, they're the oldest club in the NHL for a reason, so a club as old as Montreal has got to have a few notable players. However, bar none, if you want to talk about Montreal Canadian legends, the first name that's on the list is probably their all-time greatest player, Maurice Richard. Is the top of the pile on the list. Now, of course, he's born and raised in Montreal. He born in Montreal, died in Montreal, played for the Canadiens from 1942 to 1916. He was born as Joseph Henry Maurice Rockard Richard. Richard played 18 for the Canadiens. He was the first player in NHL history to score 50 goals in a season. And he accomplished it in 50 games in 1944 and 1945, and he was the first to reach 500 career goals. And he retired in 1960 as the NHL all-time leader of goals with 544. He won the most valuable player in 1947, played 13 All-Star games and 14 NHL All-Star teams, and is one of the 100 greatest players in NHL history. And of course, he was known as the Pocket Rocket, along with his younger brother Henry, which we'll talk about in a bit. He was part of 8 Stanley Cup champion teams including 5 straight from 1956 to 1960 as the team captain. In fact, he's also the name of the Maurice Richard Trophy given to the league's annual leading goal scorer. He's got quite an interesting story, too. He come from a poverty-stricken family during the Great Depression. Injuries prevented him from joining the military, and he became very well known for his physical and occasionally violent style of play. But especially the big thing about Maurice Richard was that Maurice Richard what has is a massive icon in Quebec. He's probably one of their Quebec's most famous sons. And honestly, he is a big part of Canadian folklore, especially for those of Quebecois. Especially for Quebecois, he's a massive icon of the region. Next to him, of course, is his younger brother Henry, who's also had a fantastic career as well. He's played for 21 seasons, in fact, 1955 to 1975. Henry, Maurice Richard's younger brother, he was the pocket rocket, but he was still a legendary player. In fact, he has actually won the most Stanley Cups of any player all time, 11 of them. In fact, he and the NBA's Bill Russell are the tie for the record for the most championships won by an athlete in a North American sports league. Again, he's also another legendary player for the Canadiens. And he's still a massively important part, just like his brother was. Part of what he was. He may not have been the master of a goal scorer like his brother was, but he's still been incredibly successful and a winning player. And of course, the next player on my list is Patrick Roy. From 1984 to 1995, of course, the legendary goalkeeper. Noah St. Patrick. He's one of the NHL's greatest goalkeepers of all time, if not probably considered by many to be one of the top goalkeepers. He was well known for popularizing the butterfly style goaltending, which basically has been since the dominant goaltending style around the world. In fact, he was born in Quebec City. He was drafted by the Canadiens in the 1984 draft, and he didn't even like it because he was a fan of the Nordiques. However, he ended up being an amazing goalkeeper for the Canadiens during his time in Montreal, and he even led them to a Stanley Cup title in 1993. However, unfortunately, sadly for a lot of people in Montreal, and something that Montreal fans didn't want to hear, he actually got traded out of Montreal to Colorado. When Mario Tremblay had a very strained relationship with Patrick Roy, and eventually all the stuff came to head in December 25th. Roy played against Toronto in the worst home game in home history, an 11-1 loss, where Roy allowed 9 goals. As a result, during the ownership of Molson Breweries, he got traded over from Montreal to Toronto. And eventually he truly became an NHL legend when he got to Colorado, and that's where he truly became the legend he is today in Montreal. But that being said, he's still a Montreal Canadiens legend, and he still had a massive legacy in Montreal. But Roy truly became he's still a major Canadiens legend. So, pretty important stuff, of course. The next iconic player I want to bring up here as well, Guy Lafleur. He is right wing, played from 1971 to 1985 with Guy Lafleur. He was the first player in NHL history to score 50 goals in 6 straight seasons, as well as 50 goals and 100 points in 6 consecutive seasons. He also played for the New York Rangers and Quebec Nordiques. In 17 seasons, he's won 5 Stanley Cups, one of the 100 greatest players of all time, and he was a big part of the Montreal Canadiens dynasty in the 1970s. He actually had a retirement in 1983, but he returned back in 1988 for 3 more seasons with the Rangers and Nordiques. But definitely a very iconic player and rightfully another amazing legend. There's so many of them. Howard Moritz, 1923 to 1927, a old school player if you ask me. but he was one of the NHL's very first stars, playing 14 seasons in the league. And he was part of the Stanley Cup winning team 3 times, all of which with the Canadiens. And he was in one of the top 10 leagues, scored 10 times during his time in the NHL. Unfortunately, he passed away young, at only 34 in 1937, due to complications of his broken leg. And the Canadiens actually retired it, his number. And he was the first player who got his number retired. It was the first time the team had ever done so for any player in the Canadiens. So he is still one of the greatest players of all time. He passed away far too young. And of course, thankfully, the Canadiens honor him by retiring his number. He's the Montreal player star that built all the other ones that is yet to come. Then we have John Beliveau, major center. He was a big part of all these great Canadian teams in the 50s and 60s. Major center. He was known by his nickname, the Gros Bill, and one of the greatest sitters in NHL history, and one of the 10 greatest players in NHL history. He has built a massive legacy, of course. He's been an absolute major part. He's won the Conn Smythe Trophy as a playoff MVP, Art Ross, 2 Hart Memorial trophies, and he was the 4th player to score 500 goals. Then you also have Bernie Giaffron, Doug Harvey, and Ken Dryden as other major legends of the Montreal Canadiens. And of course, this club has many more notable players to even begin with. There are so many of them. And some of these other players that are major parts of the Canadiens Hall of Fame, they include guys in the Hall of Fame as players. Guy Carbonneau is a big one. Chris Chelios played for the Canadiens, of course. He was also well known for playing in the Red Wings, of course. Doug Harvey. Doug Gilmour has also been a big part of it. Tony Esposito. Yeah, lots of different guys. You also have Saku Koivu, also played for the club too. So yes, lots of legendary players to suit up for Montreal. And our last slide covering here for the Canadiens is the Bell Center, which is the home of the Canadiens since 1996. They replaced the historic Montreal Forum. It's actually the largest arena in all of Canada. Its capacity is 20,962. It's the 2nd largest ice hockey arena in the world. The only one that's larger is the SK Arena in St. Petersburg, Russia, which houses 22,000 people. Along with hockey, the Bell Center has hosted major concerts and occasional mixed martial arts and professional wrestling events, and has been one of the world's biggest arenas since 1996. This historic arena also can be built for other sports. In fact, if you build it for basketball, it can host 22,000 people. And of course, it can host concerts, amphitheater, and theater as well. And it's only one of 2 NHL teams to use an old Sox siren to mark the end of periods instead of a horn. And it was inherited from the old Montreal Forum, of course. And a lot of people have performed here, including Beyonce. Beyonce performed here. 21 Pilots, Celine Dion, of course, Coldplay, Rihanna, Guns N' Roses, and more have all performed at the Bell Center, the major main venue for Montreal for a large entertainment event. So yeah, definitely a really cool arena with a rich history. So that covers a bit about the Montreal Canadiens for you guys. Very historic NHL squad and a very important part of the Canadiens. That covers a bit about Montreal, guys. And yes, when I was in Quebec, by the way, I saw Canadiens gear all over the place. I almost thought of getting me one of these Canadian gears. Because trust me, the Canadiens are a big deal here in this. Oh yeah, and one more thing about getting tickets to the Canadiens play as well. Um, um, Canadiens also have absolutely crazy fans too. Pretty cool stuff, of course. Of course, they also have some minor league affiliates. The American Hockey League, EHL, their main one is actually in Laval, just north of Montreal, the Laval Rocket. Then, of course, the EHL, the second league down, is in Trois Rivières, the Three Rivers. So, Canadiens absolutely have a massive amount of history. Hey, Sherwood Dev, good to see you, my dude. No worries, Sherwood Dev. I keep it in slow mode. I think that's something the mod has always done, slow mode. No worries, Sherwood Dev. I hope you're having a good day. We're here in Canada. Here we're in the province of Ontario. We're doing the historic NHL rivalry, the Canadiens and Maple Leafs is what we're covering today. This is one of the most historic rivalries in the NHL, dating back to 1917. Currently, right now, the all-time series, the Montreal Canadiens lead the all-time series, 414 wins to 336 losses. It's 414, 336, 88 and 14 record all time. Postseason has mainly been the Canadiens have basically been more successful of the two teams currently. But this is a very historic rivalry. Now, of course, the other NHL rivalry will most likely be covering in the future series is going to be in the Western Conference. That's the Battle of Alberta. This other really big, major in Canada rivalry, NHL rivalry in Canada. The Battle of Alberta, the Flames and the Oilers. And this was another pretty big rivalry too. And I'll be very excited to cover the Flames and Oilers. Most notably, I'll be excited to cover the Oilers because, well, you guys all know of a guy named Wayne Gretzky. I'll always talk to you guys about. I may not know about ice hockey a lot, but I can tell you quite a bit about Gretzky, of course. The legendary Wayne Gretzky, the great one. He's the all-time greatest player in NHL history by a margin. It's crazy to think that Gretzky's holds so many records, and it took all the way to this season for his goal scoring record to be shattered. A really cool thing about Wayne Gretzky, though, such a legendary. No worries about it. Sorry, Dad, about lurking. You're more than welcome to lurk whenever you need to. So let's see who's flying along with us for our next leg here in Canada, of course. Our team one flying along, of course. We're not too far from our second stop, of course, in Norwood Airport. Wait, I'm gonna look at my. So our next game day flight next week, we'll be covering our very next game day flight. And that's going to be the 12th. Our next game day flight is going to be December 12th. And it's going to be the big rivalry matchup in the Netherlands next week. That's right, Ajax and Feyenoord are going to be next week. So we're going to go to the Netherlands, everyone. Not a country I've done a lot too much flying over. But it was a tough one, though, because Indiana and Kentucky was also that game December 12th. It was Indiana versus Kentucky. That was a pretty big one. Red Wings Blackhawks is a pretty important one for the NHL. And, of course, the Tyne-Wear Derby with Sunderland and Newcastle was another one I considered. But I ultimately chose the Netherlands since we haven't really been to the Netherlands very much. And of course, very close to getting it was the Army-Navy game. I just felt like the Netherlands would have made more sense. We had a college football game just a week ago at Ohio State, Michigan. So I wanted to do the Netherlands with Ajax and Feyenoord. I thought that would be really cool to cover soccer from a place quite different than the ones we visited. That's next week's stream. That's what we're covering next week. But yeah, there's definitely some really interesting stuff about the Canadiens, of course. Also, fun fact about the Canadiens: they're also the last Canadian team that has won the Stanley Cup so far. Back in 1992, 1993, they're the last time a Canadian team has won the Stanley Cup. Which was the last time a Canadian team has won the Stanley Cup. And the reason this was the last time a Canadian team has still not won a Stanley Cup is, guys, you know how many American teams have been added into the NHL in recent memory? There's only 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 Canadian teams versus 25 U.S. teams. Why we haven't seen a Canadian team win a Stanley Cup sometime. Been way more U.S. focused, especially since expansion era, especially during the 90s, especially. And all of this was due to the fact that Wayne Gretzky got traded to the LA Kings. The greatest player in the world traded to the LA Kings. So, pretty interesting stuff going on. Of course, the Canadiens used to play at the Montreal Forum, which nowadays is now a multiplex cinema. But the Montreal Forum was once the temple of Montreal Canadiens hockey from 1926 to 1996 for 70 years. 15 Stanley Cups were clinched and presented on that ice. Um, it was a huge stadium with it was an ice hockey rink with a rich tradition. Very historically important NHL stadium. And it was also where the Summit Series was played in the 70s with Canada and the USSR. And also many concerts are hosted here. The Beatles played there, Black Sabbath played there, Queen played there, Journey, and more. Very important stuff. It was an old stadium, and nowadays it's now in multiplex. So important stuff with the Montreal Forum. But yeah, very old, very venerable. You can still see some old pictures of the old Forum. It is a very old ground with a very it was definitely a very old place. Very important stuff. We're going to be about to land here. We're going to go ahead and turn off autopilot and prepare for landing, of course. Our airport should be not too far from here. So we've got one last leg left to go after this, and we'll be covering the Toronto Maple Leafs, the other major, one of the other major team in this rivalry, of course. So I'm very excited to cover the other parts, even though they've not been quite nearly successful as the Canadiens are. I mean, they're still one of the NHL's most important ones. If you guys enjoy this sort of content, smash that follow button and follow the channel. We stream here twice a week, Fridays and Sundays here on Twitch. So yeah, Flow is officially back, so it should be interesting to do it. I'm not going to get Flow right now. I'm upgrading my once I get my gaming PC upgraded and stuff and get everything working, I'll start bringing Flow to the computer. I'll get Flow and I'll everything transition over to there. Oh, we land right here, guys. So there it is, everyone. Welcome to Norwood. So we'll stay here for about a minute or two. See if anyone else wants to join on in and fly around. We're on Southeast Asia server, exclamation point server. We're on Southeast Asia. And we are in here's our route. We're going to go ahead and prepare for the last leg of the flight. This one's going to be the shortest leg, actually. We're going to fly into downtown Toronto, and we're going to be getting some pictures, of course. Let's go ahead and prepare for our last leg here in Canada. Guys? So here we are, guys. We're about to make our way up. So here we go. And we make our way over to Toronto, baby. So today, guys, we're gonna make. Once we get to 2000, we'll talk about the Maple Leafs for a bit. Here we go. We're gonna climb up to 2,000 feet. So we're going to go ahead and talk about the other major team in this rivalry, of course, in this historic matchup, the Toronto Maple Leafs. Of course. Now, if the Toronto Maple Leafs were more for if the Canadiens were more for the French-speaking club and more represent the French side of things, then the English represented more of the English side of things of the rivalry. But the Maple Leafs, or simply known as the Leafs, of course, are a member of the NHL, playing in the Eastern Conference in the Atlantic Division. The club is currently owned by the Maple Leaf Sports Entertainment. Also owns several other teams in the city. And they were founded as the Toronto Arenas in the 1917-1918 season. And then they were rebranded 2 years later to the St. Patrick's. And then, of course, in 1927, Conn Smythe renamed the franchise to the Maple Leafs, and it's stuck in 1927, and it's stuck ever since. And it's stuck ever since. Originally played in Mutual Street Arena, but eventually was moved to the famous Maple Leaf Gardens back in 1927. Then they currently play at Scotiabank Arena. Toronto has actually won more Stanley Cup champions and played more NHL seasons than any other team outside of the Montreal Canadiens, of course. The club has won an impressive 13 Stanley Cups, second most of any NHL franchise, with two major dynasties occurring between 1946 and 1951 and the 1961 to 1967 seasons, where they combined a record of 11 Stanley Cup champions during this time period. However, after that success happened, the Canadiens have had a massive championship drought of 57 seasons, which is the longest in league history. Of course, several individuals who are associated with the club have been in the Hockey Hall of Fame. 19 players have had their numbers retired by the Maple Leafs, including the first ever in professional sports. We'll get to that when we get there. But this club has had a really rich history, of course. Currently, the Maple Leafs, their head coach is Craig Berube. Their captain is Austin Matthews, who is one of the best players in the world, by the way. They have two other affiliates, the Toronto Marlies of the AHL, and in the ECHL, it's the Cincinnati Cyclones. Pretty big stuff, though, for the Maple Leafs. Rich history and stuff all throughout this club, of course. One interesting thing about their team culture, and something that you should definitely bring up about the Canadiens, is their fan base. And it's absolutely huge. In fact, the price of a Maple Leafs home game ticket is the highest among any team in the NHL. Now, Scotiabank Arena holds 18,000 people, of course, but yes, their tickets are very expensive, as you can probably tell, because they have a massive fan base. With 15,000 of these reserved for season ticket holders. Due to their tickets, their sales limited to 10,000 people on the wait list. And as of March 2016, Leafs season tickets have a renewal rate of 99%, which means if you were to clear the existing wait list, you require more than 250 years worth of waiting, which is as a result, Maple Leafs tickets are bleeping expensive. In fact, the tickets for tomorrow's game, I'm looking at Ticketmaster as I speak. Let's see how much tickets are worth for the Maple Leafs Canadiens game, if I can even find tickets for this in the first place. Free. Okay, let's see these tickets. 327 Canadian dollars. Which is about $234, and that's actually in the still in the upper deck seating. $234 for upper deck seats. Yeah, it's expensive. Maple Leaf ticket games are not cheap. They are very expensive. These fans are also very dedicated in their support and loyalty to the team despite their performance. They're considered to have been the largest fan in the league. Absolutely fan base. In fact, in a study by Sports Retro Fanatics revealed that the Leafs and Minnesota Wild were the only two NHL teams to average arena sellouts despite their winning percentage. However, despite their loyalty, the fan base has voiced displeasure with the club in the past. One of which, during the 2011-2012 seasons, fans attended the game chant for Ron Wilson's dismissal. As well. In addition to the Greater Toronto area, many fans live throughout Ontario, Quebec, include New York State and Michigan. As a result, Leafs away games in Montreal, Ottawa, Buffalo, and Detroit hold more of a shared crowd, and due to the fact these fans in those areas stays close proximity to the Toronto area is why they're so popular. And finally, the Leafs are a very popular team in the Atlantic parts of Canada, including being favored in Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and Newfoundland Labrador. But yes, the Maple Leafs have a ginormous fan base. So they're definitely the NHL's most well-known fan base. Very passionate fans, that's for sure. If not a bit delusional, but there you go. Of course, the Maple Leafs have other rivalries, of course. While definitely their most well-known, their biggest rival definitely is Montreal. They also have several other really big ones too. Of course, the Bruins is a big one. While not quite as heated as Boston's rivalry with Montreal, Toronto is still a very heated rival as well, dating back to Boston's original season, 1924. And these two teams have played the postseason 16 times, including one of which a Stanley Cup final. And they have been renewed in quite a few playoff appearances in 2013, 2018, 2019, and 2024. They also have a rivalry with Buffalo due to their proximity between Toronto and Montreal, Buffalo and Toronto by 100 miles from each other. Of course, one of their bigger rivals for Toronto is been the Red Wings. The Red Wings and Maple Leafs are still big rivals, of course. They've been dating back to 1927, and they met each other in 16 different playoff series, as well as 7 different Stanley Cup finals. It's one of their biggest rivalries. However, when the Leafs moved to the Eastern Conference in 1988, the Red Wings, who were at the West at the time, faced in very few matchups, and the rivalry stagnated a bit since the height of the rivalries in the 40s and 50s. But however, once they became divisional rival again, the Red Wings and Maple Leafs became a bigger rivalry as well. This is definitely a pretty big deal. And the last rivalry I want to cover is the rivalry with Ottawa, which is actually, this is the youngest of the rivalries, but this is important as this holds supremacy for the province of Ontario. And they've met quite a few times, playoffs 4 times, and the Leafs won those 4 playoff series. Of course, definitely a pretty big deal. Definitely some pretty big other rivalries for our Maple Leafs there. Now, of course, the branding of the Maple Leafs is one of the most iconic in the NHL. They've had through several images, symbols through the years. And their jersey has actually a long history, and it's one of the best NHL jerseys for fans. They've been altered quite a few times. Of course, they were once known as the Toronto Rangers with the E, then they became the St. Pats in 1919 with green. However, when Conn Smythe bought the club in 1927, purchased it, and renamed it to the Maple Leafs, logo was a 48-point maple leaf with the words lettered in white, and their jersey is one of the most iconic. The simple blue with alternating thin stripes in the arms, leg, and shoulder. The road uniform is white. And this was the basic design for the next 40 years, in fact. While the Maple Leaf has changed a few times, the blue and white has not. Right here, this one, the picture here was more of their simplified version of it from 1970, where they changed it for a more 11-point leaf. And that design lasted all the way from 1970 to 2016, when they changed it, returning back to the logo of their earlier design as well. Of course, their mascot, of course, is Carlton the Bear. Carlton the Bear is their mascot, the anthropomorphic polar bear. His name and number, and then he wears number 60, comes from the location of the original Maple Leaf Gardens at 60 Carlton Street, where the Leafs played throughout much of their history. And he first debuted back in July 29th, 1995. It was his first public appearance, and his first regular season appearance was October 10th that year. Yes, the blue and white is definitely a major icon. Maple Leafs. Can't go wrong with the blue. Um, and of course, being one of the NHL's oldest franchises and being one of the original six, the Maple Leafs have so many major legends at this. Um, First legend I wanted to bring up on this list, and his number is probably retired, is one of a more modern player, but one of the best modern Maple Leafs, of course, is Mats Sundin from Sweden. He was drafted first overall in 1989. He played for the Quebec Nordiques. Then he was traded in 1994 to the Toronto Maple Leafs. He exchanged quite a few other players, and that's where really became a star, was with the Maple Leafs, which Matsudan played a big role with the Maple Leafs, including a 41 goal season, his most prolific season. He was a big part of helping the Maple Leafs get through a couple of their playoff appearances. Definitely one of their most iconic players of the 90s. But definitely a modern day Toronto Maple Leaf legend. Then the next player on the Maple Leafs I want to talk about is Dave Keon. Now, he might just be possibly the greatest Toronto Maple Leaf of all time. Dave Keon, from 1960 to 1982, born from Noranda in Quebec. He was probably their most successful, including winning the Calder Memorial Trophy, which is basically their Rookie of the Year, and 4 Stanley Cup championships with the Maple Leafs. And he's considered to be, and he was named the greatest player in team history. He became a big part of the Maple Leafs dynasty in the 1960s. A legendary player. It took him a long time for him to get due to his bitter treatment of the Leafs after he left. Eventually, he was honored. He did appear back in 2007. Dave Keon is a true Maple Leafs legend, probably one of their greatest players of all time. Then you have Daryl Sittler from 1970 to 1982, another legendary Maple Leaf star. He scored the most NFL record for the most points in one game, where he scored 10 points in a single match against the Bruins. 6 goals and 4 assists, and he still remains the most recent NHL player to score 6 goals in a game. He is born and raised in St. Jacobs, Ontario. Sittler played absolutely ridiculous player during his prime. And of course, in 1977, his 17 points still rank him third in the regular season behind Guy Lafleur and Brian Tutler. And he was definitely a big piece of Maple Leafs history. He also played for the Detroit Red Wings and the Philadelphia Flyers as well, but he is truly a legend for the Maple Leafs. Then, of course, next one is Ace Bailey. Again, one of the other NHL's also among the first stars of the league is Ace Bailey, and he was one of the first stars of the league. He played for the Maple Leafs for 8 seasons from 1926 to 1933. However, his career ended shortly when he received a hit from the Bruins defenseman Eddie Shore, which he was severely injured with a fractured skull. And Bailey became the first, after he ended his career shortly, he became the first professional sports player to have his jersey retired in his honor. And he still became part of the Hockey Hall of Fame in 1975. It was a career-ending injury, of course. And he was the first ever player to ever be retired by an NHL team. But still want to be, and it's the first one to be retired in professional sports. So, very important player. Then we have Johnny Bower, well-known guard, a big piece. The China Wall is his nickname. He was the main star goaltender of the Toronto Blue Jays during their dynasty back in the 1960s. He's one of the 100 greatest players of all time, and he was definitely a goalkeeping legend. He also served in the Canadian military during World War II. Um, he was a very big legend of the. In fact, he was the first goalkeeper to do a poke check. Very important player in that too. Brett Kelly, major center that led the team in the 1960s. He actually won 4 Stanley Cups with the Maple Leafs, and he also won 4 during his time in Detroit. And he actually has won more Stanley Cups. He won the most Stanley Cups of any player that has not played with the Montreal Canadiens. Another big legend. George Armstrong, major winger. He played from 1949 to 1971, all 21 seasons with the Maple Leafs. He was the captain for 13 seasons and won 4 Stanley Cup champions in 7 NHL All-Star games. He was a true Maple Leafs legend. Or from Skeid, Ontario. He became the legendary Maple Leaf. Definitely Mr. Maple Leaf, if I'm right. Now, here's an interesting name you guys probably see on this list. Tim Horton. Now, of course, you all probably know, for all you guys who have been around Canadian culture, you guys would know Tim Horton as the place where you get coffee and your donuts. Well, what if I told you that Tim Horton was actually also a legendary ice hockey star? He played 24 seasons in the league, and he played the vast majority of that as a Maple Leafs legend. While he was playing for the New York Rangers, Pittsburgh Penguins, and the Buffalo Sabres, and he was a 4-time Stanley Cup champion too, in 1962, 1963, 1964, and 1967. Unfortunately, he died young due to a single vehicle car crash with drugs and alcohol involved. But Tim Horton had a legendary career with the Maple Leafs. Global All-Star games, and he was named the first team All-Star 3 times. And of course, you all know about his involvement with Tim Hortons restaurants. So, yes, he was actually a legendary player. And then most recently, a more recent star, but one of the best players in the world, Auston Matthews. He's on his way to be an absolute legend at the club, at the franchise. He's one of the best players in the world thanks to his lethal shot and all-around game. In fact, his goal-scorer rate has drawn comparisons to that of Alexander Ovechkin. He was drafted first overall by the Maple Leafs in 2016, and he's become truly one of the greats in this league. He's been multiple-time All-Star. He's been a 7-time. He's been a 7-time NHL All-Star. He won an All-Star Game MVP. He's won the Maurice Richard Trophy 3 times already. I mean, he's on his way to being one of the all-time greats as a Toronto Maple Leaf. And of course, they're playing me. Hey, Larry Gopnik, good to see you. Larry, it's been a while. I hope you're doing well, Larry. Yeah, NHL Hockey 94 on the Sega Genesis. Oh, that's old school. I used to have NHL Hockey 2K, NHL 2K back in the day. Yes, I used to have NHL 2K back in the day. That's old school. But yeah, we're doing the Maple Leafs and Canadiens today. The legendary NHL rivalry with the 2 legendary NHL franchises in Canada. I thought it would be something a little different besides soccer or college football. I wanted to do something a little. So they play their games at the Scotiabank Arena, formerly known as the Air Canada Centre. It's not just the home of the Maple Leafs, it's also the home of the NBA's Toronto Raptors, as well as the AHL's Toronto Marlies, and the Raptors now have 5 of the G League. This arena was about 61,000 square meters in size, and in fact, before this became an arena, it actually was constructed back in 1941 as the Toronto Postal Delivery Building. It was mainly used as a postal site until this place was originally now turned into an arena. So, but this is still one of the busiest arenas in the world, and it's actually the busiest arena in Canada, and the most photographed location in the country, believe it or not, according to Instagram. The arena seats around 19,000 for basketball, but for ice hockey, it can go between 18,800 people to 20,000 with standing room. Now, of course, this stadium actually replaced the historic, Maple Leaf Gardens, which was the home of the Maple Leafs from 1931 to 1999. Nearly 70 years of playing at the Maple Leaf Gardens. Very historic ground for ice hockey. Nowadays, the Maple Leaf Gardens has turned into a shopping center. It's turned into a multi-purpose facility with a supermarket and an arena for the Toronto Metropolitan University, top level. But yeah, you can still visit the old Maple Leaf Gardens. Pretty cool stuff. So guys, that concludes our slides for today's flight. And it looks like we got here at a good time. We're about to arrive into Toronto. About time to cover the Maple Leafs, of course. We're about to arrive into beautiful, back into Toronto, of course. Now, if you guys don't know anything about Toronto, this is by far the largest city in all of Canada, and not even close. 2.79 million people lived in 2021 for the population in 2021 estimates. In 2024, the estimate was supposed to be 3.2 million, and that's just the major area. Its greater metro area, the Greater Toronto area, is around 6.7 million, and the Golden Horseshoe area, 11.1 million people. It is the most populous city in Canada, and it is the capital city of the province of Ontario. In North America's fourth most populous city. Toronto is an international center for business, finance, arts, sports, and culture, and it's one of the most cosmopolitan, multicultural cities in the world. Of course, with the many people immigrating to Canada end up in Toronto, about half residents were born outside Canada, with over 200 different ethnic origins represented, with over 160 different languages in the city. Of course, the most famous landmark in the city is the CN Tower, which was built. But you also got multiple museums, galleries, festivals, and more that have been built here. About 26 million visitors visit Toronto each year. So millions actually visit this. We're going to go ahead and turn off autopilot. That's because we're going to be flying. I'll briefly fly over the side of it, of course. We'll fly over the arena. We'll make our way down to our ending flight. So I hope you guys have some really cool plans this weekend, of course. We continue our flying here. So I hope you guys enjoyed this stream. I know it's been so here we are, guys. So that's our final stop here. Before we get to our final stop, I want to fly over the sea. This is Toronto, everyone. See, CN Tower. Now, not far from the arena, next to the CN Tower in the arena, you can find the Rogers Center. And that is the longtime home of the Toronto Blue Jays of Major League Baseball. Here's guys, Steve Power and the Rogers Center, of course. The Blue Jays have played here since 1989. Of course, most famously, this stadium was where Joe Carr hit his famous home run in that 1993 World Series to get the Blue Jays their second World Series title in a row. And yeah, the Jays were also in last year's World Series. This past World Series, unfortunately, sadly for American fans in the United States, the Blue Jays didn't win the World Series. I wish they would have won it. It would have been so good to see the Dodgers lose another World Series. Instead, we had to contend. Instead, we had to see the Dodgers win another World Series. Bah humbug. So, of course, they also have the Toronto Argonauts, which is actually the oldest sports franchise in the United States to still keep its original name, is the Argonauts. And in fact, they date back to 1873. They're actually the oldest sports team in the city, actually. And it's the oldest surviving team in the CFL, dating back to 1873. And of course, they're the winners of the Grey Cup 19 times. So very historic team in Canada. And of course, they also got the NBA's Toronto Raptors too. So that is it, everyone. We finally made it to Toronto, Ontario. We finally made it to Toronto, Ontario today. I hope you guys enjoyed this flight and learned some bit of history about some bits of ice hockey history. So we'll be back on Sunday for our National Park Series in the National Park flights. We're going to be making our way down and checking out Hawaii volcanoes. A beautiful time at the park. So we're going to go say hello to MSFS Official, if you guys don't mind. We'll say hello to the group there. So take care, everyone, and have a great start to your weekend, everyone. I hope you guys enjoy your stream. Take care, and I hope to see you all again soon. Take care, everyone, and have a fantastic start to your weekend. Goodbye, everyone.